Dr. Robbins, welcome back to Constitutional Chats. Your opening thoughts, and we'll see with.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on and discussing this important issue of the president's powers and foreign affairs. There's a lot going on. Obviously, you can just look in the news. Foreign policy is always a really important topic. And with the Trump administration coming in, there's just a lot going on with policy. And I hope we can discuss a lot of that in the course of this session. Going back to basics, to the Constitution, that's where we always want to start. If you look at the foreign affairs powers as defined by the Constitution, there really isn't a lot there. It's kind of interesting. When you look at other more domestic powers, you see everything well defined, but in the foreign affairs area, there's not as much really written down. And it's important to understand that the founding fathers understood how foreign affairs worked. They didn't feel they needed to write down a lot about it because they figured the executive would take care of it. The foreign affairs power is what is called an inherent power under the Constitution. That is, it is a power that all countries have. All states have this. They all have to relate to each other. So it really doesn't matter what constitution you have in any other country. Every country conducts foreign affairs. And so the Supreme Court has defined this as an inherent power. And with respect to the president's role, in almost every case and internationally, it's always the head of state or the chief executive of another country that handles foreign policy. And John Locke wrote about this. He called it the federative power. That is just the power, the way that states interrelate. So that's why the president is the chief foreign policy officer of the United States, as being the chief executive. Now, it's not that the Constitution doesn't say anything about it. Of course it does. In Article 2, Section 2, we see the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, for example, which is a very important foreign policy-related power. He can negotiate treaties, for example. That's another power that he has internationally, and conduct executive agreements. So, for example, the nuclear agreement that President Obama reached with Iran was not a treaty, it was an executive agreement, which is a different type of thing. He can use executive orders to influence foreign policy. He can appoint ambassadors and also appointing his cabinet officials who deal with foreign policy. So that's another power that he has. And he can recognize foreign governments. Do we have relations with specific government? For example, the Taliban government. We do not recognize that as a legitimate government. And it's the president's power to say yes or no to that. And then also the president is active in any kind of diplomatic engagement or crisis management, because when a crisis hits, you need to have one person kind of handling that, and then that falls to the president. So there are a lot of inherent powers there for the president to wield, but as you know, our Constitution is set up with shared powers and with checks and balances. And so it's not like the president can just do anything that he wants. For example, we mentioned the treaty negotiation that the president can do. Well, okay, but that treaty has to be ratified by the Senate. If the Senate doesn't like the treaty, doesn't think that it fits with our national interests, then maybe that treaty won't get ratified. With the ambassadors and senior diplomats or senior cabinet officials, again, the Senate has to approve them, right, with advice and consent of the Senate. So, and we've seen in the Trump administration, some people maybe haven't passed the bar, other people have. So that's just a way that the Senate can check this power. Also, the declaration of war, which is exclusively a congressional power. It is not up to the president. The president may ask for it, but it's up to Congress to declare war. But interesting thing about that, we haven't actually declared war on another country since 1942 during World War II, when we declared war on Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, who were aligned with Germany in that war. And so since then, presidents have had a little bit more leeway in terms of getting us involved in foreign military interventions, just because of the nature of things. It's hard to get a declaration of war, and sometimes you have to respond more forcefully, like the president and the Houthis recently, who are attacking international shipping. But we didn't have to wait for a declaration of war. In fact, the Houthis we don't even recognize as a government. They're just a terrorist organization. So the president consults with Congress before taking military action, but it's usually short of an outright declaration of war. And that's just kind of an interesting question that keeps popping back up. Like, will we ever declare war again? Interesting question. It's up to Congress to raise the military, the Army and the Navy, and to pay for them, right? The power of the purse strings. So the president can request a military budget he thinks he needs. Congress may pass it. They may have their own ideas. So that's another way that Congress gets involved in it. Regulation of international commerce is another thing that the Congress can do. Regulating immigration and naturalization, another thing that Congress can do that has an international impact. And then just a general executive oversight, asking for executive agencies to report out on things that are going on, things that they're doing. Congress usually does this as part of the budget process. So while the president leads this whole situation, Congress has a definite role, and usually it's a role of checking the president, even with giving deference to his leadership role in foreign policy. Then we have the courts, because the courts are involved too. You know, that's part of our constitutional framework. We have our three branches of government, and they check each other. So the courts can get involved in this. It could be just through judicial review. Maybe a case comes up relevant to foreign policy. Now, these are actually pretty rare. You don't see a lot of foreign policy cases before the Supreme Court, but they do happen. And so sometimes that serves as a check on presidential power. The Supreme Court can adjudicate disputes in which the United States is a party with another foreign government, for example. It might be dealing with the interpretation of a treaty or with international law. That's another way the courts get into it. And then something we've seen recently, cases of habeas corpus and due process. A few years ago, you might see this coming up in the context of, say, an international terrorist that we captured somewhere. And then the question of what rights does that terrorist have? What kind of court should they be tried in? Is it a military tribunal? Is it a federal court? What is it? Lately, we've seen this case arising with respect to illegal immigrants, particularly those involved in cartels and gangs, which our government now defines as terrorist. And what due process rights do they have? So just raising the issue that it's a way that the courts get involved in these things. With President Trump, we've seen him using the full range of executive powers. Diplomatic, for example. He's involved in a lot of diplomacy around the world, whether it's Ukraine trying to come up with a ceasefire, dealing with Israel and Gaza, or in the Mideast right now, where he's, looking at relations with Iran and the Arab states and that whole powder keg and how to keep that under control. So lots of diplomatic activity in this administration. We've also seen use of the military, the attacks on the Houthis that we mentioned, or other military actions, sending aid to the Ukrainians, or managing the military alliance in NATO, another important part of that. We've seen him using economic tools, the whole argument over tariffs, the recent trade agreement with China, in which tariffs were used as a way to kind of leverage power to get China to agree to something. That's another way that the president can manage foreign policy. And also law enforcement. We've seen the president using law enforcement tools to try to close down the southern border and deal with this influx of gangs and cartelistas and other people like that who've been causing problems in this country. Congress has largely supported what the president has been doing in his second term. There's been a little bit of debate, but by and large, so far, Congress has been amenable to the president's foreign policy actions. We've seen pushback in the courts, however, as I'm sure you've noted, with some of the national level injunctions against certain presidential powers. And just keep an eye on the newspapers, because the Supreme Court is going to be discussing this over the next couple of days, and whether these national level injunctions will hold, or whether the president can have the freedom to go ahead and conduct foreign policy the way that he wants. So that's my basic overview of the roots of these presidential powers and the way that the current administration has been using them. Of course, there's a long history between the Constitution and now, and we can talk about the various aspects of that, or we can keep a focus on current events. I'm really open to discussing anything you want in this realm. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Those are great opening comments. And Janine, I know you've got a lot of questions, so we're going to go to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Robbins. Appreciate that very thorough and succinct and understandable. a lot of times these things come forth and you're like, wait, what? That was very clear. So thank you very much.
Okay.
I want to talk about the void in foreign relations when America is not there. But before I get and what happens, I think that's really important for our young listeners to understand. But before I get there, you touched on two things I think are really interesting. I kind of feel, wasn't it the War Powers Act around the Vietnam War that started giving the president more power during war? But I'm curious what happened with the Korean War, because that was before the Vietnam War. War Power Act may be interesting to discuss ever so briefly so that people understand that that's Congress gave that to the president so that the president could then declare in essence kind of a pseudo war. But to think that all the wars that we've been in since World War II have never been declared, I personally think is scary. I mean, I think Congress has lost its power to control the situation and check the executive branch. And I personally think, if you're a Democrat and you have a Democrat president, then you're like, go for it. If you're a Republican, you have a Republican president, you're like, go for it. But, still in the middle somewhere, it seems like that's not really a great thing. And I think that same correlation is with executive agreements. That was a sidestep tap dance around Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, where the Senate has to approve all treaties. I don't like that either. So that's been a gross, I think, mishandling of Congress, giving the power away to another branch. So now I want to discuss that and I don't know how we get it back. I mean, you'd have to get a Congress to pass another War Powers Act, which, constrains the president. And did the president before the War Powers Act have the right? I think he does, or she, in the Constitution that says if we were attacked immediately by like a nuclear bomb, the president could respond. I think there's an imminent clause sort of thing in there. I don't think that we really needed to give the president the War Powers Act. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, these are all really important points. And when you look at the role of the executive, say before World War II, was the president out there getting us involved in wars? Well, there were like little things that happened here and there, stuff you don't really read much about in history, where there was like a little military intervention or just some little thing. But they were very limited, usually limited in time and limited in scope and geography. It was only after World War II that we started to see this problem. And as you noted, first with Korea, which was a police action under the authority of the United Nations. So the United States didn't declare war, but we went along with what the UN was doing, like they declared war. So fine, we were involved in it. And that's where we started to see the first limits on the executive, because Harry Truman tried to nationalize the steel industry in pursuit of this conflict, but then the Supreme Court said no, because it wasn't a big enough crisis. So we started to see those limits coming on. Then with the Vietnam War, which was very controversial and a large-scale effort, an unconventional war, out of that we had the War Powers Act, as you noted. That was 1973, in which Congress said, well, look, if you're going to do these things, at least tell us. At least notify Congress in advance of what you're going to do. But in practice,
let me stop you right there. What gave the president the power to do that in the first place? Is that the imminent crisis? The president can do that without getting approval from Congress. So I know the War Powers Act was saying, look, we got to put some stipulations on what the president's doing. But how did he get that power in the first place?
Well, yes, the president can respond to like an urgent military situation. And again, before World War II, there were things like this, but they were very small. After you get past World War II and you start getting in the nuclear era with nuclear missiles, that can reach from continent to continent, you basically have to give the president the power to respond, because there's no way, if something's going to hit us in 30 minutes, then.
But doesn't he have that already in the Constitution? Isn't that already there? Isn't it?
Depending, yes, against imminent attack, or if there's an actual attack. So if an attack is underway, nuclear attack, yes, the president could respond. He doesn't need anyone's authority. And Congress lives with that. But with these other things, Congress wants to be involved. So, for example, before Operation Desert Storm, Congress authorized it. They came up with an authorization. We don't declare war anymore. We have authorization of force. Same after 9/11. After the 9/11 terror attacks, when we were going to attack Afghanistan, Congress passed an authorization for that, and also for Iraq. So Congress has tried to push back against this claim of executive authority through funding mechanisms and these joint statements that say, yes, we authorize you to use force. But then presidents will take that authorization and then go do whatever they want. And Congress will come back and say, that's not what we meant. So, a 20-year war in Afghanistan, for example, was that what Congress authorized, or did they envision something a little bit shorter? I think it's the latter. So there's this ongoing struggle between the executive, who wants to just do things, and Congress, who wants to rein them back.
Well, let's talk about the War Powers Act then, because the War Powers Act, doesn't it limit the amount of time the president can actually be involved in this war? Because the Vietnam War, we had heavy casualties, and it went on for a lengthy period of time. At what point could Congress have reined back the executive and ceased this situation, or reclaimed their power to declare or not to declare war? I mean, it's such a slippery slope.
It really is. And it gets back to your original point about maybe we should just go back to declaring wars already. I mean, make it unambiguous. Like, if we're at war, we're at war. And if we're not, we're not. And there's a lot to be said for that. But
so how would that be done? How would that be done? Would that mean the people would have to write a petition to change the War Powers Act to say, you can't do anything unless we approve it, unless it's an imminent? I mean, how in other words, I'm a not just talk about it person, but how do you fix it person? So how could we fix that?
That's very good. Well, right. Under the War Powers Act, the president can take unilateral action for about 90 days. Of course, these things go on for longer than that. All he has to do is inform Congress, beforehand, say, hey, I'm going to do something. They don't have a say so. He just informs, and then he can go do things. And at the end of that period, then there's a congressional review. But
is that what happened in Vietnam? I mean, after 90 days, Congress approved it to continue?
No. What happened in Vietnam was we had something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which came at the beginning of this war. And we were already involved with military advisors and arms agreements and things like that. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution came after some North Vietnamese communist ships attacked some of our ships in Gulf of Tonkin, which is right off Vietnam. And people debate about how many ships there were, how much damage was done, and all that. But the point is, Congress then passed a resolution authorizing Lyndon Johnson, the president, to then send active military, combat troops, into Vietnam. And so that's when we started our deployments. And that's kind of like the start of the war, or one of the starts of the war. And after that, the only control Congress had over this was through the military funding. They could have shut down the war by just saying no funds will be used for Vietnam, but they chose not to do that because, as you know, in the budgeting process, it's extremely complicated, and very rarely do you get everybody on one side of an issue where they're just going to shut something down. So that was the only mechanism of control that Congress reasonably had, was the funding mechanism, and they chose not to use it until very late in the war, until we were almost out.
So what would the solution be now if we were to write a petition now? That wars need to be declared by Congress unless it's some kind of imminent situation? I mean, there's this 90-day clause, but obviously it went on forever. I mean, if we were to write a new Wars Power Act, what would that be? And I only have about, a minute left here.
Well, I think that raising the issue of why don't we declare wars anymore is a really valid one, because up until World War II, that's how things were conducted. We either went to war or we didn't. And we should have declarations of war, in my opinion, because then you have a start and you have a finish. And when you're out of the war and you don't have these endless 20-year things like were we at war? What was that in Afghanistan? We don't even know. We know what it was defeat in the end. So I think getting back to just saying, hey, we should have actual declared wars as provided for by the Constitution would really get rid of a lot of this ambiguity.
Yep. So in other words, go back to what the Constitution talked about in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
The way the founders originally had it. Okay, I have to toss to my fellow panelists here, but can you answer a question for me just in like a minute or two, and then I'm going to like literally so I can pass. What would there is a void when America is not present in international relations, because that's when nature abhors a vacuum. That's when Russia steps in or China steps in. So it is important that diplomatically, whatever way it may be, that we keep our presence felt. Can you just talk about the importance of that very quickly, please, sir?
Yeah, critically important. And again, this is something that goes back to World War II, because after that war, the United States was the dominant economy in the world and the dominant military force. And we're still pretty much both of those now. And since then, the U.S. has been the guarantor of the international sea lanes and international stability. I mean, that's been our leadership role, because at first we were the only ones who could do it. And now we're the only ones who we want to do it, because we certainly don't want China to do it and we don't want Russia to do it. So we have to keep that role. And to the extent that if we're pulling back from our international commitments, it does create openings for these other countries. I mean, China is aggressively pursuing the mantle of global leadership. They would love to be seen as the world's most important power. They see themselves that way. That's what, China, the Middle Kingdom, that's what their name means. And so they see themselves that way. We're just in the way. And so if we voluntarily pull back all of our commitments, we are just handing it to China and to a lesser extent to Russia, because Vladimir Putin has said he wants to rebuild the Russian Empire. Well, that includes a lot of our allies. That includes the Baltic states. That includes Poland. That includes, Georgia and other countries on the periphery of current Russia. So, yeah, he's an imperialist. He said so. We cannot just step back from that, because they will take it if we do.
Right. And they put up puppet leaders to do and say what they want. And their Bill of Rights, if they had any in the first place, are going to be gone the minute Russia and China take over in those places. And may figure that out too late in the process. So that's one of the reasons it's important that we stay involved. I agree with that. Thank you so much, Dr. Robbins. Appreciate you. And I'm going to pass. Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Robbins. This is Jewel Gilbert, and thank you so much for everything you've explained so far. I want to ask you something that you may have already said, but I'm going to distill it a bit. So, the War Powers Act, you would say that is something that's a positive development, or that it somewhat obscures the founders' view of how the executive was supposed to exercise that power of being, the chief executive of the military, chief general, commander in chief?
Well, it's kind of a compromise measure in a way. What happened with that was, coming out of Vietnam, there were some people, and again, it's 1973 when this first passed. It's been amended since then, but there were people in Congress who felt that Presidents Johnson and Nixon had done too much or overstepped their authority or what have you, and they wanted to figure out a way, well, how do we check that? Well, one way to do that would have been what we were just discussing, like only have declared wars. But instead of that, they came up with this War Powers Act construction, where it allows the president to do some things for a limited amount of time, but then Congress can take a vote on whether or not post facto they would authorize it. And this in practice hasn't worked out so well, because presidents can just take that window of opportunity and just go do stuff. Like, for example, the invasion of Grenada, which was under the War Powers Act framework. It was very successful, and President Reagan did a great job. But Congress complained that they weren't notified because basically right before the invasion, they got a phone call. Hey, by the way, we're invading Grenada, and then off they went. Now, there were very good operational security reasons for keeping it a secret because the whole thing was a secret. And, you talk to Congress, maybe it's going to leak. So they were afraid of that. But the point is, Reagan just did it and it was done. And then in subsequent conflicts, the president has basically just used the power that they get anyway. And the War Powers Act hasn't limited the president the way that it might have. And some people even say that it's unconstitutional. There are reasons to believe that. So they definitely have to revisit this question. If it goes back to we should declare war, I think that's completely valid. That's in line with what the framers intended. Or come up with something that's a little more, strikes a better balance. But again, in these days when there's so many fast moving things, you can't really hamstring the president because he may have to react quickly. So whatever the solution is, it can't take away that power.
So how can the president exercise the commander-in-chief role that the founders saw without being able to have these 90 days where they can do whatever they want? How are they able to exercise? How could they exercise that role whilst needing the Congress to declare war? And I'm not really asking as if it's a critique of what you said. I'm more so asking to understand how our founders would have understood the government to work as far as this in this case.
Well, I think that the founders, and also based on some of the things that they did, would understand that you have big crises and you have smaller crises. And when it's a big crisis, you want to get everybody involved. You need to deliberate with Congress. You need to have a definitive statement. And really, a declaration of war, it's in the president's interest to have that because that's an express grant of power. You declare war, you suddenly have all of these powers to do things. So a president would actually want that, I would think. But, things went on back even in the days of the founders in terms of frontier war and wars against pirates and these small scale things. There was no declaration, but it was understood that the executive was there just to take care of it. You know what I mean? Okay, the Barbary pirates, they're hassling our ships. Okay, we're going to send the Marines in and just take care of it. There was no notion that oh, then we're going to occupy Morocco for 20 years and nation build. No, they had no concept of that. That wasn't what they were thinking. It was just deal with it. So that kind of deal with it mentality escalated over the years until it became things like Afghanistan or Vietnam, or, it wasn't just stamping out a little crisis. It became this full-scale national commitment. So I think that's where the founders would say, hey, wait a minute, don't you want to declare war? Or don't you want it to be more definitive? And also to have an endpoint, because the way that we really get into trouble in these situations is where we don't have an endpoint. Because World War II, which was a massive national effort, just an incredible global effort, it had an endpoint. We're going to defeat Germany, defeat Japan, and it's done. And the war's over, and we move on. That's what the founders kind of thought about war. It had a start and it had an end. You had an objective and you reached it, or not. But hopefully, yes. And the kind of contingencies, what they call complex contingencies that we have today, they kind of had that back in the day, but they were never long-term. They were kind of those things that happened and then they went away. So that's where we get into this problem of where by abandoning this previous view of war, we kind of get into these situations where it just goes on endlessly.
Thank you. I have another. My final kind of question is and comment is as I grow up, as I learn more, foreign policy becomes so much more complicated. Even then, it's the more I learn, the more complicated it gets. It's tied up in economic policy. It's tied up in so much that we see politically from our leaders, but then also people who are not directly that don't answer politically besides being appointed by the president. So our CIA or other agencies like that. So We know that President Trump has talked about the United States protecting shipping lanes, and then we were talking today about recently he's been talking about how the United States economically supports so much for whether we're talking about NATO or we're talking about other areas of defense for other countries. So my question is, we've talked about isolationism a little bit on the show before, but we've also talked about how there needs to be, judging from history, there needs to be some strong that America retreating does not seem like it's a very wise, like completely retreating doesn't seem like it's a very wise course of action. I'm sure that some listeners will disagree, but most of our guests think that doesn't seem to make great sense. So the question is, how do you thread, as foreign policy, as people sitting here, and of course, giving our feedback to our elected officials, how do we thread that needle between being interventionalists and being complete isolationists in foreign policy? What should we be advocating for?
Well, I think the first thing you do is get rid of the ist part of what you just said, interventionist or isolationist. That is, neither of those need to be a principle, right? They're not an ism. You don't need to like be attached to either of those. The thing to do, this is my 2 cents, but it's also what we teach here at our school when we talk about strategy. You have to come up with what your interests are and what your objectives are. And sometimes your interests and objectives are going to involve being active and, having to take action like we have recently against various terrorist organizations. And sometimes your interests are going to involve maybe not being so active or maybe, retrenching a little bit. And we've seen this in the debate over trade. Should it be free trade? Should it be fair trade? I'm really interested in free trade if it's fair. But if it's not fair, if we're the only ones being fair and no one else is, well, that's not good for us. So maybe there's a case to be made for that. Where I think the debate bogs down is when people get dug into like an isolationist or interventionist perspective that is separate from the discussion of interest and separate from a discussion of like concrete objectives. And that's also a problem in foreign policy in general, as we've already discussed. If you don't have like a specific thing you're going after, but you just kind of like, have a 20-year war, have a nation building effort that goes nowhere. Well, yeah, that's not going to work out. So you really have to define things. What are your interests? What are you going after? Have a short-term plan for that. And then if it needs to go longer, review it and see, is this really in our interest or not? Because often it's just we get involved in something and then it just goes on forever without a review. So like NATO, case in point. Like, do we still need NATO? I think absolutely we do. Absolutely, NATO is useful to us, but it's worth discussing, right? It's worth making the case. If you have to make the case again, make it again, but don't just let things go on forever.
Thank you very much. I'll pass on to Wyatt.
Yes, thank you, Jewel, and thank you, Dr. Robbins, for being here. I just love foreign relations, learning more about it and the importance that the president has in their role. So this is just a really great conversation. I just want to briefly mention too, I really liked your example of Grenada, because you were talking about how the military intervened, but it also carried some consequences that they might not have intentionally planned, because the Grenada, or is it Grenada or Grenada?
Grenada.
Grenada, thank you.
Yeah.
They had recognized Queen Elizabeth II as their head of state. And if I'm not mistaken, that did cause some rift between Thatcher and Reagan. Ultimately, obviously, the relationship remained strong and they were still able to work together just fine. But I mean, it did cause a bit of an embarrassment to the British. And I think it's just really interesting how presidents have to consider some of the consequences that might be unforeseen.
You're absolutely right. There was a little disagreement between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan over that issue, Grenada. She was against the invasion. Reagan was a little bit miffed by that, not only because our allies should stand with us, but because we backed their invasion of the Falklands, which had just been a year earlier. After Argentina occupied the Falkland Islands and Britain went down and took them back. And we had backed them in that. So now here's Ronald Reagan saying, I want my island. So, invasion. And Thatcher didn't back him on that. Ultimately, she came around. I mean, the reason for that invasion was that there had been a communist revolution on the island, and there was a lot of bad stuff going on. And in particular, there were American citizens there who were students at the university. And there was a fear in our country that they might become hostages like we had in Iran. Remember the hostage crisis in Iran? And the New Jewel movement, so-called, which had taken over that island, was really brutal. I mean, they were hardcore communists. So that's how that happened. But yeah, there was that issue with Britain, but it didn't rise to the level where it was going to stop this.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I just, like I said, I'm a big history nerd, history major here, and so I just found it really fascinating. So I want to talk about kind of the structure too, because obviously, though the president is in charge of foreign policy, it's not a one man, one woman show. So I was just kind of wondering who else is very influential and important in the foreign policy decision making.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, you have the president's different departments that play a role in foreign policy. The Defense Department, obviously, the State Department is very important. But, commerce is involved in there, the intelligence community is involved. You have all of these different agencies that have a piece of that portfolio. And so that's why we have something called the National Security Council. You've probably heard of this. And what the National Security Council does, it's in the president's office. It's an executive agency, and they don't make policy or decisions. What they do is they coordinate all of these different what are called interagency actors that are in the government that have a piece of the foreign policy pie, and they bring them together and say, okay, we're going to discuss whatever the issue is, and let's hear from all of you different people. What can you bring to the table? Or do you support the policy? Do you oppose it? What don't we know? Because the president doesn't know everything. He relies on his staff and his experts to tell him what's what. I mean, he may have a good idea, and then the experts may say, well, yes, we like your idea, but you need to do this. And so that's the role that the NSC plays. They try to coordinate things. And that recent tiff we saw over the signal stuff that got out about the Houthis, I mean, yeah, that was a mistake. But what was interesting to me was I was looking at it, and that's exactly what's called the Principals Committee of the NSC, which is like the top people, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and so forth. That's the kind of discussion they have. Should we do this? What are the costs? What are the, possible bad sides of this? It's just sort of a round robin discussion of these things. And so that's how they come up with the policies.
Wow, fascinating. So and then also, how does the president impact our relationships as well as our involvement in international organizations? You touched on NATO, but also what about like United Nations, maybe some non-political organizations too, like the World Health Organization or stuff like that?
Right. Well, I mean, most of these are run out of the State Department. Most of these relationships frequently will have an ambassador or ambassador without portfolio or somebody who goes to be our liaison with them. And yes, it can get very political, like you mentioned, World Health Organization. Well, that was something where China has recently been very influential in trying to like take over that organization. So that's why the Trump administration is kind of staying arm's length from them now. I think we pulled out of it or something because of fear of a foreign government being in control of it, which is really not in the spirit of what those international organizations are supposed to do. And I mean, in other cases like the United Nations, we have a UN ambassador who's the person who's going to go there and take care of that, usually following the direction of the State Department and whatever the president wants. And it really depends, organization by organization, how important it is to us, to the extent that we pay money into it or that it pursues interests that we approve of. They don't always. And the default has been to kind of let it go, just like, well, those organizations will do what they do and we'll just be good players. But lately, the US has been pushing back a little more when we see policies being pursued that we don't like. And I think that's a beneficial sort of check and balance on these things because, these bureaucrats will just go do whatever they want if you let them.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it also begins that conversation of how do you maybe decrease some involvement, but also, I mean, you don't want to completely withdraw from these things because then that leaves a power vacuum that some of our adversaries could absolutely take control of and advantage of.
Yes. And the other thing to remember is involvement in these organizations in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't actually cost us a lot. Like the USAID money that we're saving. Okay, well, some of those programs probably weren't great, but it wasn't that expensive either. Like, in other words, don't like throw out the capability just for cost savings because you're not really saving money. Or with the Voice of America recently, that they were talking about cutting that. Our sort of outreach to the world through journalism. Well, it doesn't really cost a lot. So you're not, it's not like Doge goes in and you're saving $1 trillion. I mean, if you're only saving, $1 billion, and I know that $1 billion is still a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a good investment.
Interesting. Yeah, absolutely. And then I also wanted to ask about domestic opinion too. How does domestic opinion influence some of these foreign policies? And could you maybe give some examples of how it actually did impact in our nation's history?
Oh, definitely. If you ever study Karl von Clausewitz, those people who study military stuff, who was a military theorist, he said to conduct a war, you have to have there's a trinity you need. You need the military, you need the leadership, and you need the people. Like the people have to be behind it. So frequently in national security or foreign policy things, most of the time people aren't even paying attention. It's usually when there's a crisis that the American people start to like really pay attention to these things. And at that point, usually they'll back the government. That they're behind it. It's called the rally around the flag effect. Like if there's a attack on our interests or our troops are involved, I mean, people want to be supportive of that. So kind of the knee-jerk reaction is to support. But the thing is, that only lasts a very short period of time. So it's important for policymakers to be able to explain clearly to people what our interests are, why are we doing this, why are we, potentially sacrificing the lives of Americans, why are we spending all this money, and to limit it. Again, we get back to that notion of like having time limits on these things. Because over time, whether you look at the Korean War or the Vietnam War or the war in Iraq, if you chart out the public support for these wars, there's an almost identical curve on all of them where the approval starts high and then over time it just goes down. And people sort of question, why is this taking so long? So yes, very important at the beginning of these things to explain to people and to sustain it, but also to be conscious of the fact that just telling people isn't going to make it last forever, that you have to get it done.
Great point. Absolutely. This has just been so fascinating. I am going to hand it back over to Kathy because I know the audience questions. There's quite a bit, so give them some time to ask questions. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Wyatt. And I'm going to hand the audience questions off to Jewel. But before we do that, I'm going to ask Jorn if he might be able to put our website back up real quick on the auction. And let's show the show. And Dr. Robbins, we thank you so much. So, Jewel, Jorn, if you want to click on that button there and show the audience, if you go scroll up a little bit, scroll all the way up actually, and click home where it says right under the CA logo, you see a little house and it says home. There you go. And we will show the audience during the course of this show, our auction went up $1,000. And I think we're up now to only 48 items with no bids. And Jorn, if you want to go to view all items and click on our no bids one more time, we'll show everybody how you can look at the items that have no bids yet. Because if we get 100% items of all the bids, we make our goal in the auction. So thank you to everyone who bid today. And Jewel, I'm going to turn it over back to you for the audience questions.
All right. So we've got a bunch of audience questions. So do your best to answer these complicated, intelligent questions in rapid fire manner. So
Okay.
Sally Jones, Why has President Trump chosen Saudi Arabia as his first overseas trip for both administrations? What is so significant about Saudi Arabia?
I think that with the Saudis, there are a couple of intersections. One is energy. He wants, to work with them on energy. Another is normalization with Israel, the Abraham Accords framework, and working on that. Third thing is Iran, because the Saudis and Iranians are like bitter enemies. And so to the extent that we're trying to do negotiations with Iran, he wants to make sure that the Saudis are satisfied. And then also just the general stability of the region, because there are a lot of other terrorists and other people in that region who intersect with Saudis. So I think those are really the reasons why.
Andrew K asks, what does a congressional declaration of war do that the president cannot do within his authority as commander-in-chief?
Well, that's an interesting question, but because we haven't had a declared war in so long. But under law, when you have a declaration of war, certain powers become unlocked that the president could use that he might not otherwise be able to use. I mean, really, war is almost a return to the state of nature, if we can say that. Like if we're in like a complex contingency with another country, there's no presumption we're going to like conquer and destroy that country. But if we're at war with that country, we can do anything to them. I mean, literally, under international law, you're almost unbounded. There are just some humanitarian things and laws of war that you have to follow. But other than that, it's kind of unbounded. So it really has to do with what you can do with the powers, somewhat more than the powers themselves. War is actually a pretty scary thing.
And then another question from Andrew. Does the Department of State have a defining statute or official mission statement that establishes in law the authority of the executive branch to conduct foreign diplomatic affairs?
Well, there are laws and documents that define what the State Department can do, but if you want to talk about the constitutional basis for it, it really gets back to that inherent power. The founders understood what a diplomat was. They understood what foreign affairs were. They just didn't put it in the Constitution because it was part of a general understanding of how foreign affairs works. Now, over time, of course, there have been these defining laws and statutes and policies. But in terms of the constitutional basis of it, it's really just a mutual understanding of the international conventions and customs of diplomacy. And there are treaties, too, as well for that.
Another first a comment from William Kramer. Superb presentation. Thank you. How can we preserve our constitutional democracy when the legislative branch is afraid to use its checks and balance ability because of the fear of having the executive branch support a primary candidate opposing a specific person?
Well, the primary thing, that's all part of party politics. And if that's what you're afraid of, then I would say do better for your constituents. We've seen that on both sides of the aisle. I think the Democrats are a little more afraid of that these days than the Republicans. Of course, if you go back 10 years, it was the Tea Party movement was doing that and primarying out people. That gets into a whole different kind of political zone. But I don't think that's the reason why Congress wouldn't be using checks and balances against the executive. If anything, like contemporary for the Democrats, I think that because they oppose Trump so strongly, it is the lack of trying to do that will get you primaried out. But, again, that's a political more than a policy question, but it is really interesting to see, particularly when you get long-standing like politicians like Chuck Schumer, who are suddenly having to worry about that.
Sandy Thatcher asks, why does the U.S. not accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice?
Oh, or like the International Criminal Court? Yes, because we don't want to give up our sovereignty. I mean, that's the basic answer. If you accept the jurisdiction of these courts, then you're giving up a measure of your sovereignty. You're saying to these international courts that are populated with people that we didn't elect and we don't know who they are, being able to make very important and serious decisions regarding our senior political leadership. And, calling someone a war criminal or something like that. And we just don't want to deal with that. Now, other countries, maybe they're satisfied with that, but it would severely hamper our role as sort of the global security leader to have to worry about whether these judges, who, for all we know, I mean, they could be corrupt, they could be in the pay of our adversaries. I mean, but there's just a lot of different issues involved in it. But the root one is we just don't want to give up that sovereignty or that control.
Joel Silverthorne asks, he has a comment. He says the urgency of the Grenada situation was America. And Raven has an interesting question. Can the president delegate the golden football to the Secretary of Defense? How does Title 10 work?
Title 10, well, yeah, Title 10 is the sum of all of the laws that govern the defense establishment. So that's a pretty big question. But yeah, if you look up Title 10, that's all of the military. No, I don't think that the president can delegate responsibility for the nuclear codes to the Secretary of Defense or to anybody. I think it's pretty much his responsibility. I don't think the American people would accept such a delegation of power. And if the president is incapacitated or otherwise unable to do it, then we have a normal line of succession of people, going to the vice president and then the Speaker of the House, who would have that authority. I don't know where the Secretary of Defense would pop up in that line of authority, but I don't think the president could. Well, I don't think it would be accepted politically if he did it.
Interesting. And looks like we had some breaking news while we were on the show. So the Washington Post has announced that Trump is removing sanctions on Syria. So to close the show, what is your thoughts on that from Sally Jones? Is that good or bad?
Well, we have this new Syrian government since the Assad regime was overthrown, and this new government, which is, headed by a former terrorist, so he says he's former, and backed by Turkey. I think that this plays into the Trump administration's general view of the future for the Middle East, in which Turkey is going to play a more prominent role. And it's also outreach to this new government that says they're renouncing terrorism. So probably he's just giving them a chance to prove it.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Wonderful show. I'm not sure if anyone has some important comments to make before we close out, but thank you.
Well, we just want to thank you, Dr. Robbins, for being our guest today, and thank you for your amazing work at the Institute of World Politics. It's a wonderful organization, and we encourage any listeners who are interested in pursuing an advanced degree in the area of foreign policy to check it out. What is your website?
Oh, iwp.edu. Yeah, we have master's degrees, doctorates, certificates. We have all kinds of things.
And can people take courses online?
Absolutely. We have online distance learning. We have in person. We're right here in Washington, D.C. If you just want to come by and visit, we're happy to see you. And it's just a great community here.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you to our audience for all your great bids on our items, and keep bidding after the show. And we appreciate you all so much.